I'm here at Nottingham Contemporary. And welcome to Shimmering, Shining, Vomiting, Glitter, the Poetics and Politics of Disgust. As you may have gathered, the origin of this symposium is in the name of the group of artists that we have an exhibition of the work of upstairs. Asco, meaning nausea, and disgust, as in the phrase "mi da asco," or "you make me sick." So the starting point of this symposium was a means of understanding what that term meant or might mean in relationship to their work, and also its context of production as a group of Chicano second-generation Mexican-American artists working in East Los Angeles in the 70s and 80s. And the seed of this idea of investigating what it might mean was also planted by the way in which others had approached the work. So an article back in 2008 by our first keynote speaker, Chon Noriega, entitled "Your Art Disgusts Me," and then also an essay by Untitled Chapter and Rita Gonzalez entitled "Asco and the Politics of Revulsion." So anecdotally, the reasons why Asco chose the name Asco relate to their early work and how others reacted to it, but it also described their own repugnance towards how various forms of authority, educational, governmental, art institutional, treated the Chicano population, and in a sense, how those authorities also were turning that population into an object of disgust. I think a more open question, a question I'm less certain about, and one that will no doubt come up and be addressed here, is the way in which disgust might seem to operate through the aesthetics of the work of Asco themselves, their production of certain images, actions, and uses of the written word. Asco therefore became a starting point for a set of questions that are opened out further through the work of our four invited keynotes, whose presentations are interspersed throughout the day and a half of this symposium. The work of Imogen Tyler within the discipline of sociology in particular has allowed us to clarify a focus on the double movement that Asco's work suggests between what or whom is made to be disgusting or socially abject and how that takes place, but also in turn how that designation can be actively reconfigured and turned back as a means of revolt that generates an alternative political imaginary. And it's this question of the capacity and efficacy of disgust to be recuperated as a means of articulating critique or resistance that's central to the concern of our symposium today. In drawing attention to the operation of disgust within forms of cultural production and their attendant political implications and effects, keynote presentations by Dominic Johnson and Katie Jones, respectively, have allowed us to consider different forms of engagement with the politics and poetics of disgust, its production through live art and its reception, and within literature through the dynamics of both writing and reading. On the subject of writing and reading, my first thank you in absentia is to Patsy Valdez, from whom we lifted the title for this, the very spectacular title for this conference, so my thanks to her. Thanks also to Lucy Bradnock, lecturer in art history at the University of Nottingham, my co-convener and partner in crime in this enterprise. And many thanks too that we found in putting this idea together that the subject of disgust and its implications, both aesthetic and political, were very much in the air, that there was an appetite for disgust. And I'm very grateful and glad to have received an extraordinary response to our first, actually, the first open call we've done in the public programme, from researchers and practitioners working at different levels from emerging to established. Thank you to all those that responded and to the 9 participants that we were able to accept within the parameters of this event: Elizabeth Boer, Wayne Burrows, C. Ondine Chavoya, Harriet Curtis, Kirsten Forkett, Craig Fisher, Andres Montenegro, and Marie Thompson and Mifanwin Ryan, who will be contributing a performative intervention to this event. Thanks too to Tracy Potts and Colin Wright of the University of Nottingham Centre for Critical Theory, who've been responsible for convening a reading group on the politics and poetics of disgust that underpins this symposium. And again, we found a very strong appetite for this subject within Nottingham, so much so that we are continuing this reading group into the new year, where it will relate to our next exhibition, and particularly the way in which disgust might relate to sort of subversive forms of humour as connected to the work of Tala Madani, who we're exhibiting in the new year. Housekeeping points. You will notice that we have open Wi-Fi. This should be all lowercase though. The guest, ignore the capital G. But if you want to log on, if you want to tweet, we encourage that. But please keep your phones on a quiet setting. That's all we ask. After each individual presentation, we have 10 minutes for questions, which realistically probably means 2 immediate questions for each speaker. So please be ready to raise your hands if you have a burning question for each of them. And we hope to provide opportunities for more informal discussion in our break times, and especially the final session of the day, between 7:30 and 8:30, the drinks reception. And other housekeeping points, I think that we've got it covered. Please ask if you're trying to find somewhere to get some lunch. Just ask us, and we can point you in the right direction for that. So I'm going to move on to introduce our first 3 speakers in order of appearance. First of all, our first keynote, Chon Noriega, who is a professor of film, television, and media at UCLA, and founding director of the UCLA Chicano Studies Research Center. So he's therefore the guardian and godfather of a substantial amount of the work that we have in the exhibition upstairs. Chon is author of Shot in America, Television, the State and the Rise of Chicano Cinema, and co-author of Phantom Sightings, Art After the Chicano Movement, and LA Chicano. After Chon, I'm very pleased to welcome Elizabeth Boer, who is Professor Emerita of German at the University of Nottingham and a Fellow of the British Academy. She's published books on Kafka and Wedekind and essays on the aesthetics of disgust in Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain and Karen Du's Rain. And following Elizabeth, Craig Fisher, an artist who is resident at Primary Studios in Nottingham and a senior lecturer in fine art at the NTU School of Art and Design. His work in large-scale sculptural installations combines various fabrics and materials and questions representations of violence, disaster, and macho stereotypes. So I would now like to invite Chon to take the floor. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank Nottingham Contemporary for the exhibition and for setting up this symposium. And actually, the entire programming is quite impressive. And I've come away with a few ideas I want to take back with me to Los Angeles. But I'd also specifically like to thank Isabel and Emma and Lucy for their role in this conference today and tomorrow. And just to acknowledge 2 people in particular, one of whom I've never met, but I was haunted in writing this to figure out how would I, in some ways, engage with what I think is a very powerful argument from Imogen Tyler, and then I noticed that she's actually speaking and I didn't have to worry about it. And that I think that in some ways the presentations resonate but don't necessarily overlap. And then also Undine Travoya, who's here and who will be speaking tomorrow, and who's the co-curator of OSCO Elite of the Obscure, from which the exhibition here draws and builds upon in terms of presenting OSCO. So my presentation is called Art Between Viscera and Vomit, and I just want to start with an acknowledgement that I have a gut feeling. It will reveal itself as my visceral response to some person, place, or thing, disgust or approval, uneasiness or trust. The gut is instinctive. Rationality may follow suit, but only for the purpose of rationalizing and not regulating this emotional reaction. If you connect the eyes directly to the viscera, you have art criticism. I was recently looking at the late 1950s art reviews of a prominent art historian and early advocate of modernist art in the United States. In one typical review, color, form, and texture acquire a social resonance located not in the work, but in the artist's character and personal vision. It is the artist's expressive courage in the face of the zeitgeist that manifests itself in the formal properties of the work, where the goal is to disturb the eye rather than the mind. The critic becomes something on the order of an affective eye, following the artist's movements from hot, vivacious tones to somber, deep ones, wherein she finds a mise en abîme rather than a message. It is the materiality of the signifiers, the relief effects of bump-like protrusions and welts riding on the surface that disturb the eye. That's not my phone, I hope. And set it on a quest for meaning, forcing it to look between the crust for the real painting beneath. Now, this review could easily have been written today, at least in Los Angeles, where I live. The viscera are our soft organs. They integrate the world into our body, and they symbolize the intuitive process by which we decide quickly whether someone or something will be allowed into our mind, feelings, body, or sociality. Vomit means no. It makes clear the rejection and refusal. Now, I start with a gut feeling as the necessary context for this conference, Shimmering, Shining, Vomiting Glitter, the Poetics and Politics of Disgust. In placing art between viscera and vomit, I mean to highlight that disgust is not exceptional in the arts. Rather, it is the not to be argued with grounds for distinction, judgment, and taste. While presented as visceral, those grounds are also institutional. As a curator who has focused on Latino arts and artists, I have disgusted both artists and critics, albeit for very different reasons. The former for not advocating enough or in ways that are familiar to them, and the latter for exhibiting those artists in the first place. I shall leave the institutional dimensions for drinks at the reception later today. What I would like to do in the talk now is to focus some attention on poetics. And I will consider a Puerto Rican multimedia artist, Rafael Montañez Ortiz, and the Chicano conceptual art group OSCO. And over the past 20 years, I've written about both Ortiz and OSCO in terms of their conceptual conceits and political uses of violence within public space, media culture, and print discourse. Ortiz frames his work in terms of collective ritual and the shamanic. OSCO as a personal experience and expression of social marginalization and institutional violence. Both can be considered neo-Dada in their use of disgust as the informing logic for politically charged street performance. Most notably, both also tend to disgust their political allies more than anyone else. And I think that's an important element about both of their works. Ortiz mobilizes, and see if I get my slides going right. Nope. Ortiz mobilizes a more literal sense of disgust using blood, viscera, and vomit, and animal sacrifice. For OSCO, disgust functions as an origin story within the Chicano civil rights movement. That is, how they got their name by upsetting their peers. This origin is necessarily based on actions before the group even existed, like Cockroaches Have No Friends here in 1969. And after OSCO names itself, disgust functions as an element of style and a subject for narration. And this is their piece. It's an alternate image for asshole mural, which is not really disgusting per se, but it hovers, disgust hovers somewhere in the work's equivalence of fashion, muralism, city infrastructure, or as we say, the bowels of the city, and a socially marginalized group. Now, my goal is, and I've been thinking about what is my goal, and I came up with it this morning in the shower. My goal is to consider disgust in light of the artist Rafael Ortiz and the group OSCO, who I'm fairly convinced are really the only two Latino artists or art groups that have been thoroughly integrated into discourses of modernism in art history. And so the element of disgust there brings a certain meta level to their work. Now, in 1962, Rafael Montañez Ortiz's Destructivism, a manifesto, proclaimed a new art movement in which he said, "There are today throughout the world a handful of artists working in a way which is truly unique in art history. Theirs is an art which separates the makers from the unmakers, the assemblers from the dissemblers, and the constructors from the destructors." Now, the manifesto clearly draws from Dada in its rejection of reason and logic and consequent turn to irrationality and the unconscious as a response to war and other human atrocities. But it also marks a significant break, notable in the implied contrast Ortiz makes between destructivism and the art techniques associated with Dada. The unmade versus ready-mades, and the disassembled versus assemblage. Whatever their process, Dada artists made things. In his focus on destruction, Ortiz also obviated the distinction between object-based art and performance, opening the way to an artistic practice that crossed and mixed media. The manifesto in some ways anticipates the later dematerialization of the art object through conceptual artistic practices, but locates destructivism's raison d'etre not in an idea or form, but in a regression into chaos and destruction. Ortiz identifies both tradition and avant-garde artistic creation as grounded in the logical self and logically determined form that is complicit with the pervading will to kill in the world. In contrast, he proposed artistic destruction as a displacement, transcendental ritual, or symbolic sacrifice that releases the man-made object and the individual from the actual destruction inherent in the rational order. Now, from 1958 to 1970, Ortiz also practiced carnal destruction. In 1958, he shot a 7-minute 8mm film in a chicken slaughterhouse titled Henny Penny, The Sky is Falling. Oops, it's getting away from me. I seem to have lost the video. Yeah, there we go. Ah! I'm a Mac person.
Is it saved in the folder?
Huh?
Is it saved in the...
It's in the folder, yeah. I mean, I can just go to the folder if you want, but it's... That's the opening shot, but it's not moving.
It's not playing, okay. Do you want to bring it up through the...
I guess,
This?
yeah. I'm going to jump ahead. Weren't slides so much better? Okay. What you saw was a film from 1958, and he added in the audio from a 1966 piano destruction concert in London at the Destruction and Art Symposium. And he would subsequently, after the 1966 symposium, he would perform piano destructions using both axe and live chicken. Ortiz noted in one of his writings that 200 million chickens were slaughtered in the U.S. each year. And the actual figure at that time would have been closer to 200 million per month. And drawing from both Cuban or Caribbean Santeria and the folktale of Chicken Little, Ortiz made something that took place in slaughterhouses around the country into a ritual sacrifice, a morality tale, and a public rendering of his dinner. Yes, Ortiz would eat the chicken after each performance. Ortiz also turned his emerging artistic practice against himself, performing a self-destruction at the Mercury Theatre in London as part of the Destruction and Art Symposium. As one commentator noted, Ortiz paraded around in diapers, drinking bottles of milk. Throughout his number, Ortiz is shouting, "Mommy, Daddy, Mommy, Daddy," at the top of his lungs. At the end of his act, he vomits, plastic bags are passed out, and the audience is requested to follow suit. As Ortiz described the end of the performance, "Mommy rejected me. I'm going to reject her. I throw up, first spontaneously, then deliberately sticking my finger down my throat, vomiting up about 2 pints of milk. I then slap the puddle of vomit angrily over and over, calling, 'Mommy, Mommy.' Accepting the puddle of milk as symbolic of Mommy, I calm down, then I crawl off, 'Mommy, Ma.'" This performance later inspired primal therapy and is recounted in the opening page of Arthur Janoff's The Primal Scream in 1970, where he explains, "Some years ago, I heard something that was to change the course of my professional life and the lives of my patients. What I heard may change the nature of psychotherapy as it is now known." John Lennon and Yoko Ono would become early primal therapy patients under Janoff. What I'd like to do now is jump ahead to 1970. This woman fears for her child's safety. She leans her body into the handle of the baby carriage, pushing it with full force across the street while looking back in terror. She is finally on her own. In the background, the National Guard assaults the college students, framed by a fire hydrant and a mailbox, symbols of our society's basic infrastructures. Further back, the leaves have begun returning to the trees. It is the morning of May 5th, 1970, and the Kent State Massacre has just started again, this time as a guerrilla theater reenactment on the campus of New York University. The night before, just hours after the actual massacre in Ohio, Ralph Ortiz proposed, as he was called at the time, proposed the initial ideas for the action, joining with Richard Schechner and Joan McIntosh from the performance group, and developing them in collaboration with about 15 college students. Ortiz's 1968 survival manual for blood and flesh guerrilla theater, which described a type of performance that presents death as a reality that cannot be rationalized, provided the rough outline for the Kent State Massacre reenactment 2 years later. And the description, all in capital letters, reads, "Blood poured over the assassinated while the victim moans in death agony, pulling out the animal guts hidden under the victim's shirt." In this instance, guerrilla theater functioned as a real-time aesthetic engagement with what's going on down here, aiming to show that a problem exists, to clarify its systemic nature, and to move people toward a solution. The next morning, students staged the reenactment outside the Loeb Student Center and again off campus at McDougal and 8th Street to about 1,000 observers. In these performances, 5 armed soldiers roped together 8 prisoners and marched them onto the streets, hurling insults at them, pushing them with kicks and rifle butts for their acts of resistance. Once a crowd gathered, anyone in the crowd who laughs at the action is forcibly pulled into it and thrown in with the students. The prisoners are publicly condemned as communists and agitators and then shot, being doused by the soldiers with gallons of animal blood. The prisoners crowd in agony, pulling out animal organs concealed under their clothes. Persons in the crowd who laugh or argue or resist are thrown onto the body pile. Afterwards, police argued with onlookers about the slaughterhouse blood on the street. And as the press reported, one of the police finally said, exasperated, "People who mess up public streets should be shot." In this statement, a perverse instance of life imitating art, imitating life, we encounter a mise en abîme of blood. Slaughterhouse blood spilt as a protest against the state spilling the blood of college students who were protesting the state spilling the blood of Cambodians provides a justification for police to spill more blood. And it's duly reported in the press, and the irony is that in the two press accounts that appear, the reporters are fixated actually on the image of glistening blood and viscera drying on the sidewalks in the noon sun after the performance is over. They kind of aestheticize the discussion of it. Now this image here, which is the only documentation of the event, appeared the next day on the front page of the New York Post, providing a visual counterpart to the numerous news stories about the recent killings, as well as the growing student unrest at high schools and universities in cities across the nation. And you have to realize 1/4 of the universities in the United States shut down because of this. While the caption identified the scene as guerrilla theater, the photograph itself registers a more generalized shock about the American university as the site of social protest and police violence. The frightened mother in the foreground pushes her child off frame in the lower right corner, diametrically opposed to the action at the university. Here, the campus is figured not as a site of aspiration for the traditional middle-class family, but as a threat to its reproduction. Guerrilla theater, along with poetry, song, painting, posters, and other art forms, represented a ludic and aesthetic counterpoint to state and commercial discourses, one that was expressed within the protests themselves and refracted through the mass media. In a piece called Some Notes on a performance called 12 Evenings of Manipulations, John Hendricks tried to make clear the stakes of such artistic practice. A few days after the head and blood and soap suds and burnt food of Ortiz's cellar at Judson, 2 kids had their heads busted in some cellar on the east side. Ortiz was relevant. So were all the others. Schneeman's Rubble, Capro's Room Ripped Apart, Picard's Simple Morality Play, and Kate Millett's Caged People, and Al Hansen's Beast Man Spat Upon, and the 12 events ended with Namjoon Paik cutting his arms with a razor blade while Charlotte Moorman lay on her back playing a cello. The events are relevant. It is important that they happened. They are relevant to a state of mind that says, I don't give a shit, it doesn't concern me, I'm removed, I don't want to get involved. They are relevant, too, to a condition of art that says pure, considered, constructed, classic. The destructionists are in opposition. They are a romantic movement. They are messy and aren't very polite. It would be kind of hard to show them at Castelli's this year. Not much to buy either. Maybe they are anti-American. In May 9, Ortiz's Blood and Flesh Guerrilla Theater, in collaboration with the Guerrilla Art Action Group, performed a variation of the Kent State reenactment in Washington, D.C. during a national rally against the Vietnam War and the Kent State Massacre. The action was a procession of people holding real animal heads, skinned and bloody, with tongues and eyes. The action was one of many that Ortiz organized or took part in during May 1970, including demonstrations at the Museum of Modern Art by the Black and Puerto Rican artists of the Art Workers Coalition, collaborations with the Blood and Flesh Guerrilla Theater and the International Cultural Revolutionary Forces, a citywide art strike, and startup efforts for a new museum he had recently founded, El Museo del Barrio. In that moment, destruction as art had an immediacy that rivaled television and commercial culture, even as it also found an outlet there. Destructivism engaged in a practice that blurred the boundaries between art forms and between art and politics, and it offered a social vision that also showed a connection between, or complicity among, art museum directors and their boards, racism and poverty, and state violence at home and abroad. While symbolic, such destruction was also quite visceral, using slaughterhouse blood, brains, hearts, lungs, and other organs, but also animal sacrifice. As John Hendricks noted, Ortiz was not alone in using blood, but his art, as he said, with Raphael's work, actually it was in a way more brutal. The destructivist actions walked the line between representation and direct action, between the symbolic and the actual, and between the autonomous and the contingent. But if in doing so, the destructivists felt they had the potential to subvert culture Their use of blood could also, as Hendrick notes, trigger a kind of catatonic state in the participants, which is what happened with several participants in Washington, D.C. In this regard, destruction as art could lead to catharsis or trauma, political action, or neurogenic motor immobility. By the end of 1970, Ortiz ended his visceral destructions, shifting from animal sacrifice to psychic healing, although he continues object and text-based destructions. Now, in considering OSCO, I would like to return to the phrase shimmering, shining, vomiting glitter, which is taken from an early image text work by Patsy Valdez in 1974-75 in an issue of the Chicano movement magazine Regeneración. And I do so in part because Patsy's phrase is central to the OSCO Elite of the Obscure exhibition, upon which the current exhibition and this symposium builds. The phrase is discussed early in the curatorial essay by Undine and Rita Gonzalez, and is the subject of another core essay by Colin Gunkel that looks at OSCO's early collaborations through Regeneración. Both essays are meticulously researched and provide an excellent framing for OSCO's work around the poetics and politics of disgust, and there is little I could add in terms of the substance of their arguments. Instead, what I would like to do is poke around within the language itself. As the curatorial essay describes Patsy's phrase, the first three words are adjectives that embellish the noun glitter. Shimmering and shining are adjectives, but they are also gerunds or non-finite verbs that function as nouns. And glitter is a noun, but it is also a verb. And to some extent, these three words, shimmering, shining, and glitter, have more or less the same meaning as a quality of light. Now, vomit is another matter. Although depending on the prior contents of one's stomach, it can shimmer, shine, and glitter. And I would suggest that tequila would be critical in this regard, based on experience. But vomiting is not an adjective. That word would be vomitive. Now, the curator's argument here is an important one with respect to our understanding of OSCO. To paraphrase, qualities of light and the act of expelling food from one's stomach modify small pieces of light-reflecting decorative material that give its object a superficial attractiveness. That's, in essence, the nature of OSCO. In other words, OSCO disturbed the eye and the viscera, since all that glitters is not gold, only now it's glittier. Now let's consider this image text work more closely. What Patsy actually writes is shimmering, shinning, vomiting, glittier. Her sequence of words runs counter to the description. She has three gerunds culminating in an adjective, albeit a made-up one. The unnamed subject of these gerunds becomes glittier in the process. The absence of a noun makes the phrase deictic rather than self-referencing. To be clear, there's no deictic word here like it that points to but does not specify the referent. Instead, the phrase as a whole conjures up a referent that is entirely dependent on the context in which it is written. Now, why does all this parsing matter? After all, I had never noticed this exact phrasing before either, and I direct the archive where the object on display is preserved. And when I was preparing to talk and I noticed this last week, I immediately pulled out my cell phone camera and took a picture, and I texted it to Colin Gunkel, who's one of the writers, whereupon he responded within a minute, and I quote, "Oh shit, a whole scholarly curatorial industrial complex has been built on a misreading. I think it's best that you keep this to yourself. Ha ha." Needless to say, we could not agree on a figure for my silence. In any case, the misreading is insightful on several levels, not the least of which is the peculiar act of cleaning up the text in the artwork while arguing for its importance as a viscerally inspired provocation, which is what Colin calls it. In the process, the intellectual case loses the roughness, humor, absurdity, and dare I say nausea of its object of study. In a public presentation, Rita Gonzalez noted this process as the risk of deactivating the work. Although, to be precise, her comments had to do with the presentation of the work as fine art photography. Here, what I would point to is the way in which and I say collectively critical discourse on Osco turns disgust into a backstory. It ceases to be part of what the work is doing directly to you. But I think the main reason to parse the language is in order to make clear the poetics and politics, that the poetics and politics are not discrete categories. Each constitutes the other. Now, as it has been read, Patsy's phrase helps make an argument about Osco in the context of modernist autonomy. The argument is that from their early work on the Regeneración, Osco refined a rupture between image and text that challenged the social realist impulse of the Chicano art movement. Now, that's a familiar binary between modernism and realism. Often one, this is the qualification, it's often one that is pitched as liberating the image from merely illustrating the text or a politics, and it has often been used to divide good white male artists from bad ethnic and female artists. So here, in having made the formal distinction, there is a need to recuperate Osco back into a politics, that is, into a world of social, racial, and gender differences. In a word, there's a need to situate Osco within identity. The curators, aligning themselves with Gunkel's argument, conclude about Patsy's work. This page, I hope I haven't missed a slide here. Yep. This page can be read as a powerful testimony of the formation of subjectivity, a record of individual pain and anguish, of a relationship of gender, objectification, and violence. Note the use of testimony and record, not to mention formation of subjectivity and individual, as settled matters. The force of the work, then, derives from a double action. First, breaking free from cultural nationalist iconography and rhetoric. And second, reinscribing the social realist impulse of that iconography and rhetoric into the text itself, largely by conflating the autobiographical self and body politic with material and form. And what I want to say is this is not a critique. This is actually a brilliant maneuver within art critical discourse that brings Osco into that frame in ways that should precisely not be possible. That once you do that, you should really be stripped out of discussing the types of difference that largely do not take place within that framework. But what I'd like to offer as a supplement to that is that if we look at the actual text, both the poetics and the politics take a slightly different turn. There is no there, a noun, a subject, anything to anchor the phrase. It floats on a field of images and text. Furthermore, gerunds cannot serve as the root of an independent clause, a subject and predicate, that makes sense by itself. We must look to the context of this text in order to determine the implied referent. And there we find diffusion, removed, refused, and confused. Yes, there are subjects. We see Patsy, Osco, and an unnamed he, but also words that signal negation, pathology, and objection. Above all, there is wordplay, intended and not, alliterations that establish arbitrary groupings, eccentric calligraphy, and misspellings, malapropisms, and faulty conjugations. And these latter three, I think, really are probably one of the more consistent features of image text art. It's supposed to be a joke, but if you've seen a lot of image text art, there's a lot of consistently misspelled words and whatnot. Now, given that, the fact that shining is spelled shinning becomes hands or arms and legs, and then drawing oneself up adds a sense of agency hanging from a rope, even if the subject is still missing. The poetics here do not point toward a stable referent, let alone an identity. If anything, we find the abject, that which is cast off, hovering between subject and object. As Julia Kristeva argues in Powers of Horror, abjection is what disturbs identity, system, order, what does not respect borders, positions, rules. Here, I stress Kristeva's use of what, not who, although abjection points towards marginalized groups and intersubjectivity, or as she says, the in-between, the ambiguous, the composite. In 1993, the Whitney Museum's Abject Art, Repulsion, and Desire in American Art at once offers a name for such art and lowered the stakes by turning away from the poetic implications of its own pun with object art. Instead, the curators offered a mind-numbingly conventional schematic set of criteria for the exhibition: works using abject materials or engaging abject subject matter. In the same manner as its multicultural biennial that year, the curators announced, "Our goal is to talk dirty in the institution and degrade its atmosphere of purity and prudery by foregrounding issues of gender and sexuality in the art exhibited." The goal was identified as an urgent one in the context of neoconservative politics engaging in censorship, defunding of the arts, and attacks on civil and reproductive rights. The exhibition included Marcel Duchamp's Fountain, or rather the second version, produced in 1950, and not the original, and also a destructivist sculpture by Rafael Montañez Ortiz. But the exhibition's political vision is Manichaean. Its approach to poetics is realist. The abject is to be found in materials and subject matter. And the curatorial strategy reduces institutional critique to autoerotic discourse and self-flagellation in the face of the putative enemy who will never walk through the institution doors anyway. It's the early 1990s in the American art world. Now, something is missing here that can be found in returning to the artwork itself, not in the clean, stripped-down sense attributed to conceptual art, but as an unwieldy artifact, object, or text. With respect to Patsy's work, the third comma in her phrase is not incidental. Let's see if I've got it back up there. In the reading of that phrase as three adjectives and a noun, it must be ignored since it interrupts the reading, disconnecting the noun from its modifiers. But in the reading of that phrase as three gerunds and an adjective, it becomes a free-floating sentiment that organizes the rest of the work. Do these first three activities, it tells us, and the subject becomes glittier. Now, this is the non-syntactical and nonsensical language of corporate advertising. The associational thinking allows an affect-laden leap across logic in order to embrace the desired outcome. And what is the implied subject of this phrase? I argue that it is not subjectivity, identity, or an individual, but language, mass mediation, and corporate liberalism. Now, by way of conclusion, in 1996, I appraised Harry Gamboa's papers, which are now at Stanford University Library. I was amazed at the sheer volume of manuscripts and set about editing his collected and sometimes co-authored writings. In 1997, we met at Starbucks and spent the entire day reviewing the copy-edited manuscript pages, and we laughed and laughed and laughed. These texts, like much of Osco's body of work, depict unrelenting violence, cruelty, and absurdity, as well as Hollywood glamour, punk defiance, and cosmic irony. These take place outside melodramatic and moral discourses as a cultural logic, an administrative tactic, a family ritual, and a fact of everyday life. As I noted in the introduction to the book, Osco is significant for using these insights to speak against the grain without succumbing to the piety of an oppositional politics, and is thus able to pursue activism outside identity. If that were not the case, then Osco's implied referent, the social environment to which it is gesturing, would look a lot like the one envisioned by cultural nationalist and social protest movements that they were critiquing: a monolithic, oppressive system confronted by resistant subjects. These subjects, like the artists, are harmed, yet they're still centered and whole in the otherness of their resistance. That's too easy, and it romanticizes the injury at the core of Osco's and Ortiz's work over the last 40 and 50 years. It is an injury notable, yet not contained by, the misspellings and made-up words that get at something the King's English does not. The alternative to disgust is not approval, it is the incommensurability of laughter and action. In this regard, Kristeva's musings about Céline, whose writing often oscillated between incoherence and ellipses, applies to Ortiz and Osco as well. Their work, quote, assumes at least a double stance between disgust and laughter, apocalypse and carnival. Thus, between Viscera and Vomit, not a theme, not a message, not an identity, but the in-between. And by way of ending, I'd like to leave you with two images. This is Rafael Ortiz helping an Italian art collector redecorate. And I think this may fail here, but if I can figure out how to quit. Yeah. Somehow it's gotten ahead of me here. Just close the PowerPoint. There we go. Okay. Okay, well, this is fitting for the topic and for the conference. I did want to show you something you can see in the gallery, which is Patsy Valdez dripping egg down her mouth. And what I wanted to point out about both of these works and both of these artists, the art group and the artist, is that I would argue that their work is really not disgusting per se. It's somewhere between disgust and laughter. And what I wanted to do by way of proof is actually turn to the critic of the future that would validate me. So
all I know is my gut says maybe.
And there you have it. So thank you. I think we have a few minutes for a question, maybe not as much as intended, but oh, I did it, didn't I? Okay. The technical things, I should have brought my laptop.
Yeah, we have time for one.
Yes.
Just about some of the performance actually includes the killing of animals, live animals. Is that right?
Yes, he would do these ritual sacrifice of chickens. He's also done them of mice. He only had that one performance that was really focused in on himself, and he called it a self-destruction. And it's a part of his work that I haven't quite sorted out for myself. I understand why he stops doing it when he does, because he can no longer make that boundary he really needs for the work to be symbolic. And he can no longer justify that. And he really shifts to eugic breathing, actually, and develops a kind of style of performance that's about past life regressions. And I don't know that I understand that work either, but it's an interesting kind of dividing point around 1970.
Because I think in Europe as well, there was the killing of a dog in London, I seem to remember.
Yeah.
Which created a tremendous...
Yeah.
Yes, sorry, yeah.
No, and there's been a tradition of this, and he is somewhat different in kind of loosely tying it to culturally based ritual, but he doesn't push that too far. And he was close with the Actionist up through the 80s when they had a falling out. So.
Thanks for that paper, Chon. That was really fantastic. I wanted to go back to something that you said quite near the beginning, where you mentioned that Ortiz and Asco are really two artists or kind of two entities, I suppose, who have been kind of integrated into the history of modern art or modern and contemporary art. And I wondered if you wanted to hazard a guess as to why that might be.
That's a good question. I think in some ways it goes back to the artists themselves, who, whether or not they were responded to or engaging with a lot of the kind of issues of the moment within the arts. And they were either, in the case of Osco, I think, developing some of these things parallel, and then somewhat after that point realizing that there were partners. And Raphael was doing the same thing when he realized that what he was doing was taking place around the world. And then 4 years later with the Destruction and Art Symposium was really an international convening. And he co-convened with John Hendricks the follow-up in New York 2 years later. So I think part of it is some degree of participation, but I think the other part is that they're doing work that can make sense within the frameworks with which modern art is discussed. I think that beyond that, there's also the level of the scholarly curatorial industrial complex that people like myself and Undine and Rita and others have been working over the last 2 decades, really trying to shift the discussion about OSCO from a discussion that's limited to the Chicano movement to one that is situating it within an international frame for the arts, and with people like Undine, much more so than myself, actually trained in art history, being able to make those arguments. And what I'm pointing out here, that's why I said I've had trouble trying to figure out what this talk was about, except that I felt disgusted, is there's a degree of implied self-criticism, and the self being of myself and the others who are kind of invested in this work, that there are some contradictions, there are some mistakes being made in the interest of getting this work into a larger arena. And when Rita says, I'm aware that this may deactivate the work, she knows precisely what's happening and what the exchange is in presenting the work in 16 by 20 inch prints, which were never done and never intended because they were shot on slides. They never thought they'd have money to make a print, right? But they knew they could project them. So I think it's a kind of complicated question, and I think the answer is in part, you have to acknowledge that the artists were really quite active and interactive within the arts world, even as they on many occasions got rebuffed. Rafael Ortiz was actually widely integrated in the international arts from about 1962 to 1969. He was everywhere, and he was alongside of all people that are now considered the major people. Once 1968 happens, a lot of the artists that were like that were not white, really get pushed out into the ethnic margins, and this divide between a realist and a modernist approach gets racially mapped. It also gets mapped according to gender. And that then leads to a process 15, 20 years later to try to bring those people back into the history they were part of. And for Rafael, I can date that when he takes the efforts to create El Museo del Barrio, which he's kind of the original Moses. It's a museum in which his work would never make sense, right? And he gets kicked out, actually, after 4 years of getting it up and going. It's now celebrating its 40th year. So I guess we have time for one last question. Or yes, over here.
Thank you very much for that very interesting paper. I had a question regarding the contexts where Rafael Ortiz is working and ASCO. So we have LA and New York.
Yeah.
And they must have been really different, yet at the same time very similar. And that probably each site had different ethnic groups, most likely had different concerns. And I just wonder if you could tease out some of those contextual differences, perhaps, because it seems in your presentation that there's a strange conflation of New York and LA.
Yeah, I think you could definitely draw it out, although there are a lot of things that are happening across space. So guerrilla theater, for one, being conceptualized or theorized out of San Francisco, drawing on Che Guevara's guerrilla warfare published several years before that. And so through publications, there's really a dialogue taking place more broadly. Roughly between New York and between New York and LA is going to be Puerto Rican as the primary Latino group, and then Mexican American. Also in New York, it is where the center of the art world has kind of found itself at that point in time. And Los Angeles is only just beginning to have the infrastructure for an art scene come into place with the LA County Museum and other entities, and OSCO is actually part of that. They help set up some of these, the Los Angeles Contemporary Exhibitions. So they're working in very different environments, but I think at the same time there's a a broader awareness through the alternative press. And so, although they don't quite admit it, the OSCO members were reading the LA Free Press, and through that they were really becoming familiar with what was happening in the realm of conceptual cinema or expanded cinema, and were in some ways in dialogue with it. It's unclear exactly at what point, whether it's before, during, or after, but they're definitely involved with that. And I think it's important to trace that out as a kind of material history rather than one of likenesses, which is what often happens, or of an implied derivation because something happened slightly before. And I think with both Ortiz and OSCO, you have an instance where they're actually before some of the things that become very important. OSCO is making certain kinds of images before Cindy Sherman. Rafael Ortiz is producing recycled films at the exact same time as Bruce Conner, but he's postmodernist and Bruce Conner is high modernist. And those distinctions don't get drawn out at that time. It takes about 40 years for that to really be picked up and understood as a way in which one can rebalance the historical narrative that we have for modern art. That you get much more simultaneity and contradiction in that narrative. So, Isabel, are we done or?
Yes, but we do have
we have another speaker.
But we also have a session of board discussion, so if you have questions,
Well, I thank you all for the questions because this really is a kind of thinking through, and I'll look forward to Undine's response later today, but also his paper tomorrow, because I think that having done these exhibitions and the way that he and Rita have, having produced scholarship, and having gotten that discussion going, it's a good moment to be self-critical and think about where this goes in. I want to thank the organizers of the conference because I think Disgust, while in some ways not front line except for some specific moments, it is an operative term in that process, which has to do with the broader diversification of the art historical record. So, thank you.